Hey, this is the 5-minute podcast review for Friday, January 6, 2017. So it's the start of a new year, and that's as good an excuse as any to change up your podcast listening. And hopefully I can help with that, starting with today's 5 podcasts. So let's do it. First podcast is called What It Takes. So this is produced by a US non-profit organisation called the Academy of Achievement. Anyhow, long story short, this organisation has been recording interviews and sometimes speeches by big and very successful names in the areas of science, the arts, politics, sports and industry for over 25 years. So they're kind of like archival interviews, capturing in the interviewee's own words what it took for them to be successful. And they definitely have some interesting names, including Presidents Clinton and the first President Bush, the architect Frank Gehry, George Lucas, Benazir Bhutto, Roger Bannister, Steve Jobs, Bill Gates, and I believe Sergey Brin and Larry Page from Google are coming up. It's a pretty impressive list of people, and up till recently, these interviews weren't that available publicly. Most episodes only run 30 to 40 minutes, so it's pretty easy to fit what it takes into your listening routine. Podcast number 2 is Philosophy Bites. This is a regular and very popular series of 15 to 20 minute episodes, so in other words, bite-sized episodes, where Oxford University philosopher David Edmonds and freelance philosopher Nigel Warburton interview top philosophers on a wide range of philosophical subjects. So it ranges from deeper and more academic questions such as what it means to be conscious and moral philosophy, and of course, the meaning of life, through to more practical discussion of philosophy as it relates to issues like immigration or even swearing. Other episodes focus on summarising the philosophies of icons like Socrates, Plato, Descartes, Nietzsche and more. It's a great podcast for the many of us who are kind of aware of the subject of philosophy but interested to understand a bit more about what it actually is. So a couple of good episodes to start with are the episode from November 14, 2010 on what is philosophy, and the episode from September 1, 2013 on the famous trolley problem. And if you don't know what the trolley problem is, then definitely have a listen to that episode. I've put links on your screen to both these episodes. That's Philosophy Bites. On to podcast number 3, which is Hello Internet. This is a tricky one to describe. On paper, it's straightforward enough. 2 guys, an Australian and an American, both living in the UK, talk for up to 2 hours per episode. So there are definitely a lot of podcasts out there that are 2 guys talking, but these guys have genuinely interesting and informed discussions and debates. Both have backgrounds as internet content producers, each with YouTube channels that have hundreds of thousands of subscribers. And so essentially they've turned their proven skill at attracting an internet audience to podcasting, and it's worked. They've currently got 76 episodes since they launched at the start of 2014. And after launch, they quickly shot up the iTunes downloads charts to peak at number 1 in the UK, the US, Germany, Canada and Australia. So obviously that would have something to do with the followers they brought along from other parts of the internet, like from their YouTube channels. But they've kept a strong following for over 2 years now and have just been included in the Guardian newspaper's 50 best podcasts for 2016. So what do they actually talk about? Well, it's fairly eclectic. On their iTunes page, they say they talk about YouTube, life, work, and whatever. What I'd suggest you do is go and listen to episode 66 from last July. They call this a classic episode. That's literally the episode title, a classic episode, because it includes most of their occasional segments and is a good feel for the whole podcast series in a single episode. So I came across this podcast by accident, but it's become a regular one on my playlists. And yep, it's 2 white guys talking like so many other podcasts, but there's a reason why this is one of the best and has a huge following. So at least check it out. There's links to the Hello Internet podcast and the so-called classic episode on your screen and in the show notes. Podcast number 4 is the Minimalist podcast. So minimalism is all about living a more meaningful life with less stuff, with less clutter. For some minimalists, this means owning less than 100 items. For others, it's just a general decluttering of all the possessions, debts and time traps we accumulate to live a simpler life. The hosts of this podcast are 2 guys who found their way to minimalism, one by quitting his corporate job and the other after being laid off. Initially, they started a blog that evolved into a series of books, a documentary film, and ultimately this podcast, which started a year ago. And they now have a huge following and are something of the gurus of minimalism. So far, they've produced 48 episodes on how minimalism can be applied to a wide range of areas like technology, relationships, health, travel, parenting, and more. So, given it's a new year and an excuse for rethinking things, I reckon many of us could do a lot worse than having a listen to at least a few episodes of the Minimalist podcast and seeing if there's some food for thought there. Final podcast this week is Rome Schooled. It's a simple and original concept. Dad has 6-year-old twin daughters, they're inquisitive, but instead of turning to the laptop for answers, the three of them jump in their RV and go off on road trips to find answers in the real world. Dad brings along the recorder, and the result of each trip is a nicely produced episode of Rome Schooled. This is one of a small but growing number of podcasts that kids can connect with as much as adults. The subjects covered in each episode are often abstract and open-ended, like the latest episode, which explores the concept of personal space. So the road trips are not simplistic visits to a single destination that holds a simple answer, but rather a journey to a series of places and people, including a few experts along the way, that provide a bit of context or a point of view on the subject. So that's Rome Schooled, and that's it for the first episode of the 5-minute podcast review for 2017. If you're a new listener, there's a growing list of earlier episodes where you can check out the nearly 50 podcasts I've reviewed so far. Otherwise, I'll be back next week with 5 more podcasts. Thanks for listening.